videos, I don't know how to start them, I don't know how to end them. If we're honest here, I'm a bit shaky about what's supposed to happen between those 2 points, the filming and the editing and the narration. But at least today, I'm not alone. We're talking bad movies, and games, and movie games about bad movies. And the movie license, it was a classic early 90s game format. Right? You take a popular movie, loved by millions, you shoehorn it into whatever platform game engine you happen to have lying around, you add some sort of excuse plot about rescuing characters from the film or collecting items vaguely related to it, and you wait for the money to roll in, hopefully. Or, alternatively, you could take a poorly rated, low-budget science fiction B-movie from 1957 that hardly anyone's ever seen, and you can make a point-and-click adventure around it. Yes, this is Gremlin Interactive, and Gremlin's adventure games are weird generally. One day I'm going to work out how to do the mid-90s punk weirdness of normality justice. But you look at this game, a game of a film so obscure that the most common retail package for the game included a VHS tape of the film, so you could have some idea of what was supposed to be going on, and spoiler, this game really needs it. And you wonder how any of this could ever have come about. Now really, there are three stories here. The creation of the Plan 9 film itself, way back in the 1950s. The 1980s revivalism of low-budget B-movies that led to them being, if not in popular consciousness, at least a thriving alternative scene by the turn of the 90s. And then, finally, the game all of this spawned. The thing we came here for on this channel, which at some point was ostensibly something about games. Okay, fine. Plan 9. Let's talk about Plan 9. To know Plan 9, we must first know Ed Wood. Edward D. Wood was a man who loved pulp from an early age. He collected pulp fiction magazines and bunked off school to watch 1930s horror films, it conveniently being the 1930s at the time. He started playing with a movie camera and took a job as a cinema usher. After the Second World War, he moved to Hollywood and started directing film commercials alongside writing scripts. And, of course, playing the favourite game of everyone who lives in the LA area, trying to get into the world of feature films. Right from those early school-dodging days, Wood had idolised horror actor Bela Lugosi. And Lugosi had fallen on hard times by the 1950s. The drugs he was taking for sciatica had turned into a debilitating addiction, and he began to get a reputation for being easily confused if something unexpected happened on set. Really not great for the genre of horror. In 1952, Wood met his idol, and he found Lugosi almost destitute, existing on the film industry's equivalent of scraps and goodwill. Wood's own career was on the rise. It felt like it was starting to break through, with script writing credits on westerns followed by an offer to write, direct and star in low-budget exploitation film Glen or Glenda. Okay, I use on the rise and breakthrough in relative terms there. But still, this was enough that he could offer Lugosi a role as narrator, followed by an on-screen part as a mad scientist in Bride of the Monster, a sci-fi horror which had Wood's biggest ever budget, $70,000. Yeah, I know it was the mid-1950s, and usually I make some point about inflation here, but even back then, a top-end box office smash like Oklahoma or Guys and Dolls was more in the range of $6 million. And it really is notable how expensive even very cheap-looking films were to make in the 1950s. Yes, that inflation adjustment I'm talking about, that $70,000 is over $800,000 in today's money. That's more than some very well-regarded independent films from more modern times. And like Kevin Smith maxing out his credit cards to make Clerks in the early 90s, that was not $800,000. But with not much to spend on them in times when movies were expensive, Wood's films gained a reputation for their non-sequitur editing, their gratuitous use of stock footage, often in the incorrect aspect ratio, and bizarre writing where he'd find something cool and decide to just throw it in. Narrative consistency be damned. Well, at least I can't think of anyone else who produces moving pictures or video like that. Bride made Lugosi realise that he needed to get treatment for his opiate addiction. And Wood helped him by donating the tiny amount raised by the film's premiere toward this treatment. More than just helping out with treatment, Wood wanted to give Lugosi the kind of role that he remembered from seeing the actor in the 1930s, whether this be a film or a TV series. The idea of a TV series called Dr. Acula was proposed, and Lugosi mentioned this to be his next project in one interview. Wood shot some test footage with Lugosi in a Dracula cape in several locations, but had no script yet in mind for this. It was just isolated test footage. And if he did have something in mind, it was not to be. On August 16th, 1956, Bela Lugosi died in his sleep, inspiring the creation of Gothic rock 23 years later. Was I saying something about randomly throwing in stuff just because you felt like it? Nah, must be one of the other YouTubers. Now, a normal director would have mourned this loss and the chance to create this project, but then moved on and got on with the business of making low-budget movies. Not Ed Wood. Ed decided that Lugosi would have a major posthumous part in his theatrical science fiction epic, Grave Robbers from Outer Space, the film that would eventually be known as Plan 9. Yes, theatrical science fiction epic. Budget $60,000. Starring an actor whose only available film footage is a few isolated test shots in which he is wearing his famous Dracula cape. Not really the material of science fiction. This awkward footage was still not enough, and so Wood hired a body double. Well, a body double is normally the same height and build as the person they're doubling, hence the word, which Tom Mason, a man whose day job was being a chiropractor, was not. Also, compared to the elderly and by that point quite infirm Lugosi, he looks about 12 years old when he first appears. Yeah, so where I'm going is that this film is a mess. These things are normally a mess, but Edward D. Wood is going beyond. Ed Wood is doing, how could you ever have possibly thought that would work things? He's trying to create a grand widescreen epic even though you can only get stock footage in for free. Yes, some of the notorious visible boom mics and the like in Plan are just because we're watching it at the wrong aspect ratio because people saw the stock footage and didn't realise the whole thing is supposed to be cropped. And he's not even consistently in the genre of epic science fiction, flirting with everything from classic 1930s style pulp horror to Three Stooges style skits. So the result is definitely a mess, but it is a surprisingly watchable mess. And I'm not going to say this is a classic of cinema, at least not for the conventional reasons for things becoming a classic of cinema. But I've watched a fair few of these worst movies ever in my time, and Plan 9 avoids some of the more egregious pitfalls. For a start, it has an actual identifiable plot. And that plot might be utter nonsense, but at least it's nonsense you can follow and not be left thinking, what are these people doing? Who are they? Why are they here? Where even is this? Which was certainly my experience of attempting to watch Manos: The Hands of Fate. Yes, Plan 9 is still riddled with Deus Ex Machina moments and an out-of-nowhere justification for the entire episode late in the final act. But the barrier to entry here isn't good. It's merely identifiable. And it can be genuinely entertaining in its own right. There's this wonderful, campy scene where the grave robbers first talk with their supreme commander.
What progress has been made?
We contacted government officials. They refuse our existence.
What plan will you follow now?
Plan 9. It's been absolutely impossible to work through these Earth creatures. Their soul is too controlled.
Plan 9. Ah, yes. Plan 9 deals with the resurrection of the dead. Long-distance electrode shot into the pineal and pituitary glands of recent dead. Have you attempted any of this plan as yet?
Yes, Excellency.
How successful has it been?
We have risen 2 so far. We shall be just as successful on more.
The living, they have no suspicion of your movements?
We had to dispose of 1 policeman. However, none of those risen have been seen. At least not by anyone who still remains alive.
It's too bad it must be handled this way.
The horror scenes are obviously low budget and some of the acting barely rises above the standard of a decent school drama production. But at least you get the feeling that Edward D. Wood had some idea of how the pacing and setup of these things is supposed to work, even if he didn't necessarily have the budget or the technical ability behind the camera to make it happen. And yeah, there is plenty wrong on a technical level. Shots for critical plot points are missing. There are long periods of exposition which run with actors awkwardly trying to fill time on screen, and the jarring shifts between the silent Lugosi footage and the rest of the film are hastily explained by an off-screen narrator.
Never to return again.
Show, don't tell it's more of a guideline to be ignored when expedient here than a principle as such. The practical effects are as laughably bad as their reputation. While the flying saucers were apparently built using a model kit and not the hubcaps glued together of lore, it can't have been an expensive kit, as the end result looks like, well, a pair of hubcaps glued together. The models also look tiny in any scene they appear in. What is this? A plan from outer space for ants? But while those models are primitive, and often you can tell one of those model shots was supposed to go on a lot longer and do a lot more, usually because the film acts as if the previous scene hadn't just abruptly ended after 10 seconds of a couple of saucers drifting aimlessly across a fixed background. They do exist in service of the film. Some basic element of how you make a film has been done successfully. And what I guess I'm saying with that is that Plan 9 is not a good film, but it did keep my attention for 80 of your Earth minutes, without boredom setting in, and, there's $200 million Marvel movies I can't say that for. If I had existed as a teenager in the late 50s in the US and driven my inevitably wood-panelled station wagon into a drive-in to see whatever goofy B-movies they were showing as a double feature, I probably would have enjoyed this. Maybe I have low standards, but there would have been enough to earn its hammy acting and cheap effects a permanent place in my memory, and hold that particular thought and concept in your own memory. Grave Robbers from Outer Space premiered under that title in March 1957, but it didn't get a distribution deal until near-insolvent Distributors Corporation of America picked it up the following year, and then quickly went under thanks to being near-insolvent. DCA's assets ended up with Valiant Pictures, who gave Grave Robbers an initial release in the southern United States, under the new title Plan 9 from Outer Space. Yeah, it is really obvious when you watch the credits with their gravestone film that suddenly switches away at the very last minute. In 1961, the television rights were sold, and that really should have been it. I mean, even my dog's sighing there. It would have been an obscure, cheaply made film that would every once in a while go out late at night when nobody was watching and remind the few who were still watching that it was probably time to go to bed. And until 1980, this was indeed the case. You might have guessed from the excessive remaining runtime of this video, and that this channel was at some point in the distant past theoretically about PC games, remember those days, that things did not remain that way. It's time to talk about revivalism. In 1978, Harry Medved and his brother Michael and Randy Dreyfuss wrote a book called The 50 Worst Films of All Time. More established film critics panned the book for... Am I holding this upside down? All right. They panned the book for being littered with factual inaccuracies, placing arbitrary personal preference above informed judgment, and the teenaged Medved seemingly having little to no historical understanding of the very film they were trying to critique. Well, at least I can't think of anyone else who writes like that. The 1978 list did not actually include Plan 9, although it included other terrible B-movie favourites, such as 1953's Robot Monster. But the book was popular enough for a follow-up by Harry, again with his older brother Michael. This was based on an invitation in the first book for readers to write in with nominations for their favourite worst movie. 3,000 of them did so, and the most popular nomination was Plan 9 from Outer Space, which the second book duly elevated to the title of Worst Movie Ever. And yes, having watched the film, I do think that's unfair. I've definitely seen worse. I've seen worse even from films on a much higher budget, shot by people who should know much better. Now, unfair this might be, but it also makes sense. Plan 9 is not the worst film, but it is a bad film which is very memorable. People who saw this in flea pits and drive-ins as teenagers may have seen worse, But this is the one they would remember well enough to write in and say, hey, there was this goofy Ed Wood film I saw in the late 50s, and that has to be the worst. And, there you go. This is how public polls work. Like I said, it's bad, but it's not boring. And teenagers at a drive-in faced with a boring movie would soon find something else to be doing. Yeah, exactly. Visiting the concession stand.
Enjoy popcorn, exploded into tender, delicious, crispy bites of crunchy goodness. Enjoy the tops in cool, refreshing soft drinks. If you want to enjoy some refreshments, this is your opportunity. There will now be a short intermission.
Remembering bad movies purely to mock them might have been a short-lived craze in an era where they would be shown very late at night on broadcast television, if at all. But the 80s brought three big changes. The popularity of cable TV in the United States, the increase in channels on those cable services, and the widespread adoption of the video cassette recorder, with a similar pattern following in the UK with satellite television at the end of the decade. With more low-budget stations looking for cheap content to fill their airwaves, or perhaps the cable waves, does that work? Probably not. It was more likely for old B-movies to be shown, and thanks to the VCR, more likely they would end up in a form which could be easily shared between local groups of friends. And I watched an awful lot of 1970s Doctor Who thanks to borrowed VHS tapes of satellite broadcasts. That probably explains a lot about how I turned out, really. In 1988, this tape-swapping scene resulted in the show that made the phrase, "keep circulating the tapes," its own. Mystery Science Theatre 3000. It debuted on the small local television station KTM-ATV in Minneapolis, but as that station collapsed within a year, moved to a brand new national cable TV channel, the Comedy Channel, later Comedy Central. MST3K, to use the popular acronym, popularised these old and frequently bad movies by solving one of their major problems. They're just not actually that much fun to watch if you don't have some friends round to rip the piss after a few drinks. Manos, The Hands of Fate, starts with 9 whole minutes of just nothing. Okay, give or take a non sequitur scene of a couple kissing that was put in just to give an actress who broke her foot some screen time. So that 9 minutes, it was supposed to be the credits sequence, but then they kind of failed to create any actual on-screen credits. See earlier point about this stuff being expensive and difficult. Mystery Science Theatre 3000 solved this boredom problem by adding commentary. Host Joel Hodgson would be accompanied by several puppets, voiced by comic actors who would riff on the film along with Joel. These were largely ad-libbed, with a short turnaround time for each episode, and short skits on board the Satellite of Love would be added, so the show ran for a consistent 90 minutes, rather than the unpredictable length of whatever old horror film they'd managed to dig out of the archives for that week. This pairing of so bad they're good movies with snippets of amusing commentary supercharged the B-movie scene, especially among early adopters of the internet. MST3K gave people shared jokes, shared references, and a ready-made playlist of old movies that were also more than a bit rubbish. It was never hugely popular in its early broadcast days, but it did spawn a loyal following who spread the show's lore and love of goofy old movies, far beyond anyone who ever watched it. My first knowledge of it was people recounting jokes from it on the internet. And when it comes to Plan 9 from Outer Space itself, that's a bit the one that got away in MST3K terms. It's been covered a few times by the cast, including on spiritual successor riff tracks, and it was on the list for a recent failed attempt to crowdfund a new season, but hasn't happened as of me recording this, and certainly hadn't happened as of 1992. Nevertheless, interest in Plan 9 continued to increase in the early 90s. A documentary called Flying Saucers Over Hollywood, The Plan 9 Companion, aired in February 1992. Later in the year, Columbia Pictures announced that they intended to produce a biopic with director Tim Burton, called simply Ed Wood. Although by 1993 they would place that in turnaround mere weeks before production started, mostly due to Burton's insistence that the film be shot in authentic black and white, just like an Ed Wood movie, with Disney's Touchstone Pictures eventually stepping in to finish it. Ed Wood released in 1994 and met widespread critical acclaim. The Plan 9 game, that came out in early 1992, and it did not. Yes, it's finally time to look at how all of this translates to Amiga, Atari, and, most importantly for me, IBM PC and compatibles. Plan 9, the game. I credit my discovery of both game and film to issue 10 of PC Format, which featured a thoroughly stinking review of the Plan 9 game, and thus resulted in me never bothering to play it until now. Oh, those days when you used to trust reviews, eh? Now, most reviews for this range from similarly stinking to bizarrely high scores given how negative the review text is, but it is notable to me how many of the reviewers did appear to already be well aware of the Plan 9 film and its notoriety. So, yes, now it does make a bit more sense why Gremlin might have thought there was an audience here, and probably an audience which wouldn't be happy with a mascot platformer where you collect hubcaps and electrode guns. The game manual dives straight in with the opening words from the movie, and then a tongue-in-cheek beginner's guide to the worst movie of all time, which references the Medveds and claims that watching Plan 9 is a waste of at least 78 minutes of your time. You know what's coming, right? There is only one waste of time here, and it is this adventure game. Alright, let's try to be a little bit positive, okay? It starts well. As in, I don't mean the actual game starts well, but the credit sequence, that's a nice homage to the movie. There's some pleasing film grade effect there. Yeah, we're at that level of reaching and trying to be positive about this thing here because we start the game proper and it is like this. This is how it's going to look. All of the action takes place in that tiny window. Oh well, it would if there was any actual action in this game. Your verbs, they are a tiny gravestone in the corner, and despite icon-based inventories, right, they were pretty much the norm by 1992. No, if a scrolling list of text was good enough for Zach McCracken, it's good enough for us. But I'm a positive, easygoing person. I could pass this up. You know, if the gameplay were good, right, it would be fine. Diversion here. In car engineering, there's something called the 50-metre test. It's coined by legendary Ford engineer Richard Parry Jones. This is the idea that if you get in a car and drive it slowly for a short distance while paying close attention, you will learn an awful lot about its driving dynamics and how well engineered it is as a product. I propose, for adventure games, the first puzzle test. Identifying and solving the first puzzle in the game tells you volumes about what the entire game is going to be like. Take the case of the serrated scalpel. That tells you you're going to be looking very carefully at things. You're going to be pixel hunting details and trying to deduct in the manner of Sherlock Holmes. I think I made a long and very confused video about that while wandering around London. Leisure Suit Larry. Yeah, Leisure Suit Larry is mostly going to be avoiding the game, constantly trying to kill you. In Plan 9, my biggest problem is I can't even find the first puzzle. The game is so totally devoid of any kind of useful telegraphing that I just blunder around with things happening at random. I summon a taxi, but I can't go anywhere. I try talking to people, but most of them won't even respond. Eventually, someone mentions Bela Lugosi's house, and I can now ask the taxi to take me there. Apparently I need a key to get in. Right, fine. First puzzle finally located. Eventually I try examining some things the producer guy wouldn't let me earlier, and I do find a key. It's not the right key. The game doesn't tell me this. There's no feedback. There's no way for me to try to use this key and be told, good idea, but not with this key. It just doesn't work. I feel like I'm in a Smith song. I was looking for a key and then I found a key, and heaven knows, I'm miserable now. Allow me to compare this to Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. Another 1992 adventure game. This bit is your opening puzzle. It is immediately, obviously, blatantly clear that you are supposed to click through the junk. And once you've fallen through a couple of screens, that, you just keep going. You just keep clicking. Nothing that bad is going to happen. Hit the game's first real puzzle and we have an immediately obvious situation. We need to get inside, but this big doorman is stopping us. And the great bit? There are 3 options for solving this. There's a dialogue puzzle. There's a straight-up fight. Or there's a sliding crate puzzle to avoid that doorman entirely. There's 3 different paths. One centred around dialogue and negotiation, one around solving puzzles, and one where you mostly just punch your way through. And the game even points you toward the appropriate one based on how you approach this first puzzle. It will let you fail the fight, but it warns you that if you try that in a fight with any Nazis, you'll be dead. Keep failing, and it will hint you to try something else. This is just plain good design in that adventure game equivalent of the first 50 metres. Meanwhile, back in Plan 9, it is... Yes, it continues in exactly the way it began. I examine or push random bits of the scenery, and sometimes I uncover a new object. Was there any suggestion or reason I should do this? No, the game has told me nothing other than just to look for the aliens. So I guess I'll just click on everything and pick up everything until... There's an inventory limit. There is an inventory limit. Plan 9, just stop. You're innovating things which did not need to be innovated. Carrying more things than it could physically ever be possible to carry is one of those accepted breaks from reality in adventure games. It's one which passes without comments, even with games that are otherwise realistic. It's lampshaded in comedy games, but no, in a game which telegraphs nothing. Not only can I softlock myself by failing to obtain a necessary item, I might have that item only to drop it because it doesn't look like it's going to be useful. Now sometimes you can go back to where you found an item and you can pick it up again. But if it's something you obtained through a dialogue puzzle or from a place in the game you can't get back to, good luck with that. You are now soft-locked. Well done. Now somehow, despite all of this, I get to my first film reel, and so I get to try the game's selling point, watching bits of Plan 9 on my computer screen. Okay, it's a bit laughable by modern standards, but for a game which runs on very low specification computers, this is not bad. We don't have MPEG decoder cards here or anything, don't even have CDs. I would have been impressed if I saw that on my 286 in early 1992, and I think that shows how crazy the pace of technological development was back then. The Seventh Guest and Myst were already well in development by the time this was released. Unfortunately, the length of those film reels is inverse to their complexity, and the one which looks most like full motion video lasts barely a few seconds. And how do I know this? Because it only takes a few minutes of elevator juggling before I realise I have the solution to another puzzle. And another film reel. All of the rest of the film reels are like this. Enter a new location, click through a couple of screens, get another film reel. Work out what simple single item puzzle is hidden here to enable the next mere couple of screens, which you need to click through to get the next film reel. I'm almost feeling the obtuseness of Justified because I spend more time battling the game's inventory system than I did actually solving puzzles. Not least because those puzzles made it clear that dropping the wrong item could see me dead, soft-locked, or at least stuck in a loop until I figured out what I was missing. The long pause when you leave a taxi became a large enough proportion of my remaining playtime that I was starting to find it annoying. Not like I've found anything else annoying. Especially when you get to the end game, and that has you hopping back and forth between locations to solve a puzzle, which half makes no sense and half are the most trivially obvious immediate action to perform, given the situation you find yourself in. Yeah, that taxi thing became really irritating. And then, after all that, the game just ends. The ending appears to be related to a completely different task than the one you thought you were carrying out, and there's no justification for this sudden swapperoo. Even at the end, I'm annoyed. Now, all right, if you're feeling charitable, maybe this is an homage to the out-of-nowhere plot point of the solar night bomb from the film, but when the game finally dropped me to the DOS prompt, I found it hard to muster any reaction to this other than just, oh, it's over. And I find myself walking away from this with the same puzzled conclusion as some reviewers at the time. Is this deliberate stylistic suck, where the game is supposed to feel as bad as the film and all those dropped plot points, clunky interface decisions and disconnected settings are supposed to make you feel like you're playing the kind of adventure game Edward D. Wood might have made had he been a game designer and had 286s existed in the 1950s? And maybe that's the problem. I'm opening up myself for a comment storm here. You know, if you call this thing half-assed, you're just revealing yourself to be on the outside of an inside joke. But I think it's a missed opportunity. Yes, I know there was most likely a budget and a timeline here which precludes any of this. But I think a proper point-and-click adventure, where you solve puzzles by making scenery objects wobble over, or cutting the wires to their special effects, would have been a much better parody than this odd flick screen affair. It really tries in some places. It has scenery which it describes as, we don't know what this is either, but it was in the film. But occasionally funny writing can't save this from being a chore to play through. On a technical level, it's fine, I guess. Yeah, I didn't encounter any crashes. My save files always worked, and only once did the clunky inventory display and non-obvious mouse cursors cause me to drop the wrong item, which thankfully turned out to be non-essential. But still, if I'm reaching for "it didn't crash to DOS mid-game" as a positive thing to say about it, they've ended up with one of the worst outcomes for game of the worst film of all time. It's a game which is worse at being an adventure game than Plan 9 is at being a film. And that's really the conclusion here. If you have around an hour and a half to waste, then dig out Plan 9 the film in preference to Plan 9 the adventure game. I'm not saying it's good, but it is at least consistently entertaining. And sometimes it even manages that for the right reasons. Sometimes. At least once or twice? Maybe. Possibly. Perhaps. I don't know. I said I didn't know how to end this.